Welcome to Reddit Aliens. Hikers of Reddit, what was the scariest or weirdest thing you've seen while in the wilderness? Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. Enjoy. Coming down a mountain trail at dusk, I realize I may have lingered at the summit a bit too long. By my estimation, I've perhaps a bit less than an hour to the trailhead. I'm alone, but know the trail well, and have a headlamp on me. Just as dusk fades into a moonless, pitch-black night, I'm rounding a corner and freeze instinctively. Eye shine is reflecting back at me from the darkness about 30 yards away. The vague outline of a large, solitary black bear emerges from the forest and steps onto the trail, facing me. It stares at me, and I stare back. Black bears live in this area, I've known this, and seen them twice before during the day on previous trips. Nothing like being face to face with one at night, though. I raise my hands above my head, making myself as big as possible. I scream long and loud, as guttural and fierce a man's scream I can muster. The bear pauses and chuffs at me, briefly looking behind it and the forest it came from. It then slowly and casually turns away from me, walking back into the forest from where it came. The crunching sound of leaves underfoot of the bear grows quieter, until the only thing I can hear is my pounding heartbeat. I realize I now have to go in the same direction as the bear went. Maybe a minute or so go by, and I sprint. As I pass the point where the bear stood, I glanced at the woods while not stopping, and see nothing. Shortly after, while running, I look back behind me back up the trail to make sure I'm not followed. I continue to periodically glance behind me while running down the mountain. I endure maybe 30 long minutes of running in pitch darkness down this mountain with my heart at 130 beats per minute. Thankfully, I didn't trip or fall and injure myself, made it back to the trailhead safely. At a backcountry lake in Yellowstone, had a bear, presumably Grizz, at our camp all night. 3 of us shaking in our tent, hoping bear spray worked. The bear didn't do anything. Next morning, while cooking breakfast, noticed something swimming to our camp from a mile away. A moose crossed a massive lake and ended up in our camp. He was an asshole. Scared us more than the bear. Very aggressive. No big culmination, but we left the camp, then the moose pooped on our tent. A buddy of mine and I had a gold claim deep in the mountains in California. One day we were hiking up the river with our dogs to check out the river and see if anything changed over winter, as it sometimes does. He was an older man and saw a log and sat down for a smoke. I sat next to him, and we were facing the river with a steep mountainside behind us with a ridge about 15 plus feet up. Suddenly, his smaller dogs started whining and ran up and hid under his legs, and my German shepherd stood up and did a low growl while looking up the hill. I joked, that's not a good sign. I turned around, and a very large mountain lion was crouched, ready to pounce. We stood up, and I started yelling as I grabbed my pistol. The lion realized we weren't small, easy prey, and took off running. We knew there were bears and mountain lions around, but never saw one before. If the dogs hadn't noticed and reacted, it likely would have pounced on us and tore us up before we could fight it off. We were both armed, so one of us would have gotten off a shot. I never went anywhere there ever again without at least one gun. We were 15 miles from the nearest paved road and another 30 miles to any civilization, so being injured up there would suck. Of all of the subjects we cover here, to me, who spends a decent amount of time in the wilderness, the ones about animals are the ones that get me the most, so one of my favorite topics. On a trail in the Australian bush, beautiful day surrounded by nature. As sundown approaches, the shadows get really long and the temperatures take a massive dive, desert climate. Suddenly, and I mean like in an instant, all of the sounds of birds, insects, even the wind dry up. I cannot hear a thing. At the same time, I get this primal fear creeping up my spine. I just know something is behind me on the trail. Looking back, there is nothing at all visible, but the feeling will not go, and is so rooted in my amygdala that I start running. About 5 minutes of running down the trail, and all of the birdsong and insect noises come back, and it's like I imagined everything. I've been back to the same trail a number of times at the same time of day and never experienced anything quite like it, and it doesn't bother me to go back, but when I think of that specific day, it still sends shivers down my spine. I do a lot of week-long trips throughout Arizona. Just pick a remote location and walk for 20 to 30 miles and explore everything I can. I was south-southwest of the Mazatzals when I unpacked my gear and was setting up camp on top of this ledge overlooking this pretty wide valley. I started a little fire that started smoking and decided to take a quick piss off the ledge. As I'm mid-streaming, looking out over this valley, I look over to my right and I see an effing Mad Max looking hills have eyes mother effer taking a piss off the same ledge, looking the same direction over the valley about 75 feet away. He looks over, acts surprised, "Oh hey, I didn't see you there," and decided to walk over to introduce himself as homeless. I effing fed the guy rice and beans. He talked about God and sort of giant bones he was looking for from the original humanoid giants or something like that. There was something wrong with him, but I was scared to dismiss him from my sight or hurt his feelings. Didn't get any sleep that night and have never slept with my handgun inside my sleeping bag since. Cassowary while I was in a Queensland park. Not interested in me at all and just chilling, but you don't F with them. If we count swimming after hiking, once floated into a swarm of blue bottles, Portuguese man-o-war, that suddenly flooded in while just in my swimmers. I legit to this day have no clue how I got out of that way without a single sting. I just froze up floating on my back, didn't move a muscle, and slowly let myself get washed in by the waves while other people swimming near me back to the shore got effed. My theory is all that nasty tentacle bits were beneath the surface, and since I panicked and played safety starfish, I was on top of them all with my harmless booby bodies, while everybody who tried actually swimming were paddling beneath the surface and got their arms and legs wrapped in one. Lifeguards shut the beach real quick. I was hiking with my father last summer on the Colorado Trail. We heard noises and saw large tracks we assumed were moose. Naturally, we were on high alert since moose are terrifying. We swore through the clearing that there was a moose making noises, and when we were taking a look at it, we noticed it was not a moose, but a cow. And we later saw a whole herd of cows. That was weird, just walking in the forest and seeing a ton of cows, lol. When I was a child, about 7 or 8, we had a 3-family camping trip. While cooking s'mores in a semicircle, the campfire in the center of us, the bushes started shaking. We all stopped and glanced at the bushes, and a grizzly bear emerged and roared at us, just like in video games or movies. This effer stood up as tall as it could, spread its arms out, and effing roared. One of the dads shouted, "Get to the van now!" And the 3 moms and 3 dads made a wall in front of the bear and started shouting at it and throwing rocks. The bear was glancing around at all the parents, almost as if it was trying to pick a target or pick one of our parents to insta-kill. It then dropped from its hind legs, swiped our marshmallows, and ran back off into the brush. It clearly had done this before because it knew what marshmallows were. Later in the night, we could hear screams of neighboring campsites, same bear most likely. I remember my young self complaining to my mom that I wanted s'mores, and she was incredulous that I was thinking about s'mores when we all almost died. Parents standing up to a grizzly bear to protect their children. If you need to know what unconditional love is, here you go. I was on a trail in the Alps where you could most of the time only see a couple of meters in front of you because the side of the mountain hid the rest of the trail. Basically, to the left of you, you had the mountain at a 90-degree angle. Then in front of your little trail where 2 people could barely pass each other, and on your right side, you had a ledge with a roughly 10-meter drop. So I was already hiking for a couple of hours and was pretty much in this mental zone you get into after being physically active for a long time, where all you can concentrate on was the walking and not dropping on some rocks. But I had to be immediately wide awake when I had all of a sudden this giant Ibex stood in front of me. The thing was just strolling around the mountain and probably didn't hear or see me coming either, because you could tell it was just as shocked to see me as I was to see him. So I stood there looking this thing in the eyes, which is nearly as big as me, which probably weighing an F-ton more, on this really narrow mountain trail with no way of evading anything coming towards me. We stood there looking at each other in the eyes for a couple of seconds, and I remember feeling how my survival instinct kicked in, and I was weighing options in fractions of seconds on how to handle the situation if the thing decided I was a threat and started charging at me. I think I settled with the options to try and make myself look as big and heavy as possible, when all of a sudden, this thing just turned itself to the ledge side of the trail and just jumped down the 10-meter drop like it was nothing. I tell you, these animals are effing insane, and you won't believe what they are capable of until you see one doing these crazy jumps with your own eyes. This was truly one of the scariest and weirdest things happening to me while hiking. My siblings and I were wandering around the forest behind our neighborhood, and we came across an old refrigerator in the middle of nowhere. It had metal chains wrapped around it and a big padlock keeping it shut. We were pretty spooked by it, so we went home and told our dad about it. He came back with us to take a look for himself, and he agreed how creepy it was. The next day he notifies the police and he takes them to it. But when they returned, Dad said the fridge was gone. They could clearly make out tracks dragging it back to the road using a hand truck, and the cops suspected that it could have been something to do with the gangs and drug trafficking in the area. We were honestly really glad that we never got to see the inside of that fridge. But what really creeped us out was that there was a high chance that whoever moved that fridge saw us nosing about it and then got rid of it when we left. We quickly decided it would be for the best if we stopped exploring our local gang and drug-infested forest. Not something I saw, but something I was close to and didn't know it until a year later. I hiked the Appalachian Trail in 2014 and was very near the body of Geraldine Largay, aka Inchworm, who had gone missing in Maine the previous year while also through hiking. The area that she was last seen was a shelter deep in the woods of central Maine, easily the most remote part of the AT. This is within about 10 days hike from the northern terminus of the trail. Details of her disappearance can be found simply by Googling her name, so I won't go into them here. But, in essence, she was hiking alone, needed to pee, and wandered off the trail just a couple of hundred feet. Couldn't find her way back. She tried to find high ground to send some texts, then made camp where she spent nearly a month keeping a journal as best she could. She eventually died of exposure, having become increasingly disoriented and deprived of food. There was a massive search for her body the rest of that summer into the fall, but it was called off when winter set in. It was assumed that she fell while trying to ford a rain-swollen river. There's a number you have to ford in Maine, and had been swept downstream. In reality, her body was wrapped in her sleeping bag and lying less than 2 miles from the AT corridor. Her body was found in 2015 in that condition by a forester. She had simply gotten confused and not been able to find her way in the woods. We all knew that a hiker had gone missing in that area the year before my thru hike, but we all assumed that the official explanation was the most likely. The shelter where she was last seen had become a makeshift memorial to her by then. None of us ever imagined that she was so close by. It gave me goosebumps when they found her. I was fly fishing in northern Michigan with a good friend. We were in the middle of nowhere, and from the other side of the stream we hear a disembodied voice yell, "Catch anything good?" He and I were both surprised, but my friend yelled back, "Yeah, fishing's great today." We received absolutely no reply. The birds never stopped singing. We never heard anyone moving through the trees. It was probably just some random hiker walking by, but I never forgot how weird it was for that voice to come floating out of nowhere. And that night on the drive home, we couldn't help but speculate if someone had been watching us, and for how long. Hiked recently in an area near Tahoe that crosses the PCT and is most commonly used for snowshoeing and backcountry skiing. There's not a super obvious trail to the peak once the snow melts, and we have been among the first to do the hike following the year's snowmelt. At one point, my dog runs about 20 yards away from what All Trails says is the trail, and super intently sniffs and paws at something and won't come back. I go get him, and he is at a spot with a beautiful view over the ridge to some lakes. He's standing next to a small tree and a shallow hole with a small wooden box, coffin-shaped, large enough to hold only a small baby. We descended quickly and got out of there. It's either a very creepy sight or very sad. Either way, didn't want to stick around. If any fellow Redditors have also seen this and know any backstory, I'd love to know about it. I've had bears and moose and horses, but honestly, nothing spooked me out more than hiking in the mountains of Japan at night. Forgotten or abandoned shrines would just appear on my field of view from my headlamp, and the little shrine bells would echo around me. Trails in Japan are either concrete stairs and very looked after, or just barely a footpath. I took to hiking a trail in November, got to the peak, and took a nap with some people still hiking. Woke up 30 minutes later to nobody around. It was still before 4 p.m., so I wasn't worried. However, I forgot that I was in a valley, and by 4 p.m. I was hiking by headlamp only, walking this ridgeline. This is where the shrines started appearing and echoing in the darkness around me. We're talking one every 5 to 10 minutes or so. It gets weirder. As time goes on, I swear I hear footsteps behind me, but I convince myself it's just my water bottle crinkling and pushed forward. Later, waiting for my train to get home, I tried replicating the sound with my bottle and I couldn't. By 5 p.m. it was pitch black with the tree coverage, and I'm hiking in pure darkness. Every once in a while, I'd see a deer or boar, but I paid it no mind. But eventually I saw what I thought was a campfire on the trail and went to it thinking I could talk to some campers. They were no campers. I found a group of men burning something heavy over their shoulders into a fire about 12 feet high near a couple shacks in the woods. The fire pit was massive, something like 3 doors, making the back and sides, and one wall open to toss something on it. It was not trash, and it was not wood, because it would have been way too heavy as the bags were massive. At this point, half the shacks start barking at me, and I realized that they were kennels. All the men's flashlights turned to me in the darkness because the dogs had alerted them. I ran on the trail away as fast as I could. While still on the trail, I encountered a lot of no trespassing signs, but I was still on the official trail, and they were faced downhill where I was running to. Finally, I get out of the woods and reached the town where I could get home, and each house has their light on, but I couldn't see anyone inside. Instead, in every yard of this Japanese town had an animal in it staring me down, like lots of animals: dogs, cats, boars, deers, rabbits, foxes, tanuki. I'm very freaked out at this point and keep going. Eventually, about 30 minutes later, as I make my way to the station in this empty town, a car starts following me. If I stopped, it would stop. If I was walking, it would follow. This went on for another 30 minutes until I dashed down a foot trail between some empty, dark houses and ran all the way to the station and convenience store. It was a Lawson's. To my surprise, the guy at the counter spoke English and talked about what I had seen. He was just as confused, as he said there's nobody living in the woods anymore and there are no dog kennels in the area. When I'd left the store to go to my train, I looked up and saw there were no lights on in the entire mountainside I came down, where previously every house had every light on. I got on a train immediately, stopped at an onsen I had been before to clean myself of whatever the F had just happened, and went home ASAP. This was November of 2020. I have no idea what the F had happened, and I never went back. I usually love hiking at night. I'd loved it in the desert on my PCT hike, and in the mountains near my home in Virginia, and I continued to hike later in Hokkaido and Kyoto, but I swore to never hike at night in Japan again. Nothing has ever spooked me more than that. So, what do you think those men were throwing into the fire? Something innocent or nefarious? Went for a wander in BC, Canada, lost the trail, and let me tell you, it gets dark, like dark, literally. Can't see your hand in front of your face dark in the forest when the sun goes down. I'm alone, no source of light on me, dead silent, and literally feeling my way along the ground and from tree to tree, trying to find a road or train tracks or something. Then, suddenly I hear the most terrifying, blood-curdling lady scream I've ever heard and felt myself go numb. It was loud and close. Straight up thought someone was being murdered. Things are a fuzz from that point to when I finally stumble onto a road, but I know I was hauling ass as best I could. Fully repressed the entire thing until years later I was watching a video about wild animals, and they showed footage of a cougar screaming at night. Holy shit. As soon as I heard it, I went numb and started shaking. Then memory came rushing back of the night I thought I heard a woman get killed in the forest. Once I settled down, it occurred to me that I'm only alive right now because that cougar let me live. I'm not a small guy, 6'1", 215 athletic, and I don't really get scared, but I was absolutely terrified. And anyone that thinks they can square up with a cougar is a moron beyond help. Even though they're not super big, they will end your lineage and you won't even hear it. Hike with friends, stick to the trails, be aware of remaining daylight in your current location, bring a flashlight, bring a whistle, and drink water. Hiking with my father, uncle, and a retired former Alaskan hunting guide in the outback for a 2-day trip before end of holiday. It had to be 10 or 11 at night, but the sky was clear, so the light that really was uncanny bright moonlight. Sitting around the fire after eating all quiet like, some motion in the far distance sort of caught my eye, and I instinctively said, "A deer?" Before my brain went, "Hey, don't we have those?" But read it, I could in that moment swear to effing God it was a deer. I'd been living in Massachusetts for uni. I saw them all the time. I was absolutely sure. Uncle grabbed my leg and stopped me from getting up and said, "You didn't see it. You didn't hear it. You don't invite it." And we all just sat there staring very focused into the fire for half an hour. You could deadass hear whatever it was shuffling around us in various locations, and then it made a weird croaky gross laugh sound and whipped off at an absolutely insane speed. We hike every time I'm home for holiday, but I'll tell you what, we don't hike around there. I was about 13 or 14. My dad, my uncle, my little cousin and I were on a dirt bike quad trip up in the trail surrounding Goat River besides Creston, BC. We had finished most of our riding for the day and we found a quaint little camping spot next to the river. It was probably 5 or 6 p.m., not dark, but not super bright out either. We had a campfire going with some fish we'd managed to catch cooking over it. My cousin, who was probably around 10 years old, wandered over to the river. We heard him calling for us to come over because he saw a dog. The adults and I hastily sprint over because we knew it probably wasn't a dog and was most likely a coyote, eyeing up the child for a quick snack. What we found wasn't exactly a coyote, but could only be described as eerily close. It was longer, slender, had big eyes, and to top it off, was standing upright on its hind legs. It didn't look like a dog standing on its hind legs though. It looked humanoid in stature. It was just staring at us, never once looking away, looking at it longer. Its face didn't seem to be canine in any capacity. It had human-esque features with a fur-covered body. My dad and uncle both seemed frightened. My uncle grabbed my cousin and put him on top of their quad, while my dad told me to get my backpack and my tent bag, and they weren't staying in the woods that night. As my uncle walked back towards the campsite, the thing across the river started walking towards us. It took long strides into the deep, quick-moving water without any sign of struggling from the currents. As soon as it got to about waist deep, my dad turned to me and yelled, "We've got to go, and we've got to go now." We dashed back to our camp. My uncle and cousin were both on their quads. My dad yelled, "Leave your shit, turn the bike on and get out." My uncle and I revved up our engines and peeled out of there as fast as we could, my dad following shortly behind us. My dad's a very stoic and composed individual. We raced back to our trucks, which must have taken 2 to 3 hours in the pitch black. Once we got back, my dad claimed that he saw it sprinting behind us as we drove away, that it must have been going over 30 to 50 kilometers an hour, and that it was running on 2 legs. My dad's Native American. We're actually Iroquois Indian, and he swore that we saw a Skinwalker or something else. Either way, I've never been that terrified in my life, and I've never seen my father more shaken than that night.